Holy March, my God.
Welcome to today's broadcast of In Conversation with Dr. Sherry Cooper. We'll be exploring the world of mortgages in Canada and why it's important to have a deep understanding of this topic. To guide us through this conversation, we're joined by Dr. Sherry Cooper. Dr. Cooper is a renowned economist, financial expert, and best-selling author with over 30 years of experience in the industry. She's also the chief economist at Dominion Lending Centres, Canada's largest mortgage company. In this episode, Dr. Cooper will provide us with valuable insights and expert analysis on the current state of the Canadian housing market, the impact of interest rates on mortgages, and the importance of working with a trusted mortgage advisor. We'll also delve into the services offered by Dominion Lending Centres and why they're an invaluable resource for anyone looking to purchase a home or invest in real estate in Canada. So whether you're a first-time homebuyer, a seasoned investor, or simply interested in the world of finance, this broadcast is sure to provide you with valuable information and insights that you won't want to miss. So sit back, relax, and join us as we dive into the fascinating world of mortgages with Dr. Sherry Cooper and your host, the president of Dominion Lending Centres, Eddy Cochiolo.
All right, welcome everyone to ICW. I'm your host, Eddy Cochiolo, and it is March already. This is crazy. Well, another boring Bank of Canada announcement, no change, which I think everyone expected. And Sherry, I think you did as well. And just a reminder, as we go through today's slides, let's wait till the end until we get to any questions. But if you have a questions, please place them in your chat. And we'd be more than happy to get to them again at the end of the presentation. So Sherry, as I mentioned, not a surprise. You predicted that. You're still, I think, on the prediction of no change until at least June, maybe July, after reading what Bank of Canada and what they're mentioning. I don't think it's going to happen until July. Inflation is being stubborn.
Eddy, I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't? Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I don't know if I can hear myself, but I think we're okay. Well, I can hear you. So why don't you go ahead? So let me, yeah, okay. So Dave just said I can hear him. So let me just say to Sherry that we can hear her. Hold on a second.
I can't hear you at all. How's that happening?
I'm just letting Sherry know we can hear her. So go ahead, Sherry.
Okay, well, if you can hear me, I'll get going. Okay. Sorry about that.
Yes.
So here we are, another Bank of Canada day, and we're on our way to rate cuts. Unfortunately, not yet, but the Bank of Canada clearly believes that inflation is going to come down sufficiently to be able to start cutting interest rates by mid-year. Now, this is the kind of thing that they're looking at. They talked to us about the soft landing in the economy, and they did tell us that the economy grew at 1% in the fourth quarter, following the minus 0.5% in the third quarter. This was stronger than what they were expecting, but they also suggested that it's well below potential growth, and indeed it is a situation of an economy that is in excess supply. So this shows you the forecast for the Canadian economy. As you see here, I'm suggesting that we will not see a technical recession, defined as 2 quarters of negative GDP growth. But truly, there is something in this that's actually quite misleading, and that is the fact that real per capita GDP growth has already been declining. In other words, the burst of immigration has boosted spending in Canada, and as a result, overall GDP, but not by enough to increase per capita. So per capita measures in the third quarter were down 2.3%. You can see from this chart that the Canadian consumer is much more interest sensitive than the US consumer, as the Canadian economy has dramatically underperformed the US economy over the course of all these many rate hikes since the 2022. Now, the effects on consumers in Canada are showing significant slowdown already. The credit card delinquency rates are rising sharply. And in addition, look at this one. Business insolvencies have absolutely spiked. This is the direct result of the Canada Business Account repayments. The CBA was introduced during the pandemic to help businesses get through the lockdowns. But the repayments now are causing many businesses to become insolvent. This is a very troubling development, and it's also showing up in consumer insolvencies as well. Here's another chart that shows to you how important it is to the difference in the mortgage markets in the two countries. You can see that the mortgage debt servicing in Canada relative to disposable income is hugely more than in the United States. And that doesn't even count the fact that mortgage interest is tax deductible in the US. So the combination of the fact that our mortgages are no longer than 5 years, requiring refinancing at least every 5 years, and many had borrowed money for a shorter period, that and the fact that on average home prices are so much higher than in the US, you see why our economy is so much more interest sensitive than in the United States. Now, over the course of the last 8-9 months, the Canadian job market has remained relatively resilient. In January, we saw 37,300 new jobs created. That was up sharply from the prior month. Another significant positive is that the unemployment rate actually edged down a touch from 5.8% to 5.7%. Now, the unemployment rate was exactly 5.7% in the month before the beginning of the pandemic. So we're back to where we were then, with a much, much larger working population base as a result of tremendous immigration. We've also seen that Canadian labor shortages have plummeted now. They're below, this yellow line shows you, they are below the level at the beginning of the pandemic. So we are creating jobs, but increasingly we will begin to see that job creation is insufficient to employ all the working age people new to the country as well as existing in the country. And we will therefore see the unemployment rate rising probably to about 6.6% by the end of the year. Now, that's a very important reason why the Bank of Canada needs to cut interest rates this year, and the sooner the better. But what the bank is concerned about is twofold. They're worried about underlying inflation remaining very sticky, but they're also concerned that lower interest rates are going to lead to a tremendous burst of housing activity, which of course runs counter to their concerns about inflation. So they're trying to walk the fine line. Now, one piece of very positive news in today's Bank of Canada statement is that they said that they see evidence that wage pressures are beginning to decline. But when you look at the January data, year over year, wage inflation came in at 5.3%, well above the 2 to 3% target band the bank would like to see. The other thing that's so crucial for Canada's economic well-being is productivity. Labor market productivity has decreased sharply. And you see, it's been in a downward trend for quite a long time. And that means that unit labor costs rise, particularly as wages are rising and productivity growth is declining. So we've got unit labor costs increasing 3 times faster than the 2% inflation target. Now, let's look at the details for inflation. There has been some really good news on inflation in January, the last number available. We see that the Canadian overall consumer price index inflation has fallen to 2.9%. Now, part of that is the result of a decline in gasoline prices. When you exclude gasoline, the CPI inflation rate is 3.2%. You can see from this chart that gasoline prices have declined for 5 consecutive months, albeit at a slower pace than late last year, earlier in the cycle. We also see that 5 of the 8 CPI components decelerated in January. One that has not decelerated is the largest component, which is shelter. And this includes rents, which are going up very rapidly, as well as the imputed costs of owning a home, mortgage interest, of course, included in that, and renovations. So that's what the bank considers to be the sticky underlying inflation, and they'll be watching that closely. One piece of very good news is that food inflation has finally decelerated significantly to 3.9%. Now, keep in mind, the reason that the people in general have not noticed that inflation is decreasing is because this just means that food prices are rising at a slower pace, but they are still rising. And that's something that governments need to make clear to the public in general, especially in the US, where Biden is pinned with the inflation, and of course, an election is coming. Now, looking at CPI excluding food and energy, which is the old core inflation measure, inflation has already moved down to 2.4%, within the 1 to 3% target band. And this has led many economists to believe that the Bank of Canada should be cutting interest rates sooner rather than later. However, the bank looks at different core measures. These core measures, their favorites, are showing that core inflation continues to be roughly 3.3, 3.4%. Now that's year over year. Let's look at them on a 3-month moving average basis. You see that the inflation measures are coming down. Now, CPIX, that yellow line there, that has moved below 2%. What that measure is, it's another measure that was in favor by the Bank of Canada. It excludes the 8 most volatile sectors in the consumer price index. But the bank believes that that's misleading because too much of the CPI is very sticky. And indeed, they want to see these middle two lines not in the 3 to 4% range, but at least below 3% for a consistent period before they cut interest rates. So the message of today's press release was trying to throw cold water on the notion that the bank was imminently going to cut rates, as in the next meeting in April. Now, the Bank of Canada held overnight rates steady for the 5th consecutive meeting at 5%. They want to see core inflation falling. They say the economy is in excess demand, which is what they've been hoping for. They also are continuing to renormalize their balance sheets by letting their holdings of Government of Canada bonds run off. And that also tightens the system. But there's clearly room in the not too distant future for the bank to begin to take this 5% overnight rate down gradually. Now, in the US, the overnight rate is about 5.5%. Now, what I expect is when the bank begins to ease, which right now I think will be at the June meeting, they'll take rates down 25 basis points, and they'll do that every meeting going forward until the overnight rate is at about 2.5%. So there'll be 5 meetings, including the June meeting this year. So we will see interest rates come down about 125 basis points this year, with further cuts into next year. Now, this is the 5-year Government of Canada bond. You know that fixed mortgage rates move closely with this, and since the middle of February, that rate has moved downward. So that has helped to ease the fixed rate mortgages. Now, prime, of course, is stuck at 7.2% and will remain there, moving in lockstep when the Bank of Canada cuts interest rates later this year. That will help to get to decrease the variable mortgage rate. So this shows you the movement in fixed and variable mortgage rates. Both still remain historically quite high, particularly in comparison to 2020, 2021, when interest rates were at de minimis levels. Now let's look at the Canadian housing market. We've been through a tough time. Home sales in January, they increased, but remained well below their 10-year average. But activity, as we've seen most recently with the release of the Toronto Real Estate Board, continues to have some modest upward pressure on sales. New listings increased by 1.5% in January. New listings in Toronto were up as well for for February. Now, looking at the residential market balance, you see that the months of inventory and the sales to new listings ratio is consistent with a balanced market on average across the country as a whole. Now, it obviously varies from region to region. Home price index. You still see home prices declining. They declined again in January on a month-over-month basis. Year over year, they're up just a touch, as shown in this chart. But we're expecting that as the spring housing season emerges, we will start to see a significant increase in housing activity. Buyers who want to take advantage of the lower prices, these price declines that occurred earlier last year, and also take advantage of what's likely to be a big increase in inventories, particularly as interest rates come down. So, big questions. We know that there will be a tremendous number of renewals of mortgages, and all those households renewing or investors buying will be making decisions about fixed versus variable and fixed for how long. Now, it's a different answer depending on the risk profile of the household, their other debt, what they can qualify for, and in general, some people with near-term renewals may well want to fix their loan for another year and then take their chances on variable rate loans thereafter. Once the Bank of Canada begins to cut interest rates, it's unlikely they'll reverse that stance, especially given the weight on the economy of much higher monthly mortgage payments going forward as people refinance or renew. In fact, we've already seen evidence of rising mortgage arrears. Now, keep in mind, these are still low by historical standards and far below the levels in the United States. But nevertheless, Equifax has reported that arrears are rising both for 30-day delinquencies, but even more importantly, 90-day delinquencies. Now, the payment shock is a factor in encouraging the Bank of Canada to cut interest rates. More than 60% of Canadian mortgages will come up for renewal in the next 3 years. And depending on the timing and the kind of mortgage that is renewed, we know that monthly payments will go up at least 20-25%, and in some cases where there's been negative amortization at very low interest rates, monthly payments could go up 40%. And rare is the household that can afford that kind of increase easily. So we've seen consumers already tightening their belts, but no doubt discretionary spending will come under downward pressure as a result of this. And I can't talk about the housing market without talking about the housing shortage. And every Bank of Canada day, I try to spin a different set of data. Here I show you that Canada added a record 1.3 million people in the last year. So the population growth is at its fastest pace since the 1950s with the baby boom. And we see that Canada's population growth is the fastest pace among all the OECD countries, the developed world, rivaling the increase in population in developed nations. Now, the good news is that the immigrants we are targeting have the skill set that has been in short supply. So these people are able to find work, but as the economy slows, that's going to become more difficult. Now, this looks at the government's planned permanent immigration, and for next year, it's going to be 500,000 people. And these numbers are dwarfed by the influx of foreign students and temporary workers, both of whom want to get permanent residency status in Canada. So temporary workers are a major add-on. They accounted for 800,000 new residents on top of the planned permanent immigration. Nobody, unfortunately, seems to have been concerned about where all these people are going to live. Look what's happened to the foreign students. The number of foreign students coming into the country has just exploded. And most of the universities can't provide housing for these students. And so they too are moving into residences that would otherwise be available for families and households. So the government this year, or this past year, capped the student permits at 364,000 per year. So substantially lower than what we've seen recently, which should help. This chart is amazing. It's the annual change in population age 15 and older. That's considered working age population. So this kind of exponential growth is unsustainable, really, in terms of infrastructure and housing. And everyone knows that housing is not affordable. So over the last 2 years, we've seen almost 1 million new households created and only 400,000 housing units completed. That's units either for purchase or for rent. So that's why rents have moved up so sharply and why we're going to see housing inflation once interest rates start to come down. So you see the Canadian population and then the rent component of CPI, a mirror image. And clearly, this is a problem that will remain with us for a very long time. Now, this shows you housing starts by the type. One thing that's very notable here is that single-family housing starts are historically at extremely low levels, like going back to the post-war period, the lowest level ever. And more of what is being built are in the apartment sector, which includes condominiums. So this is the government's effort to intensify the population density near the subway routes or other transportation routes. So let's just look at this in a bit more detail. 37% of Canadian households are renters, and rent inflation in the country as a whole has averaged 12.6% year over year, second highest level in over 40 years. Now, this has been caused, of course, by an unprecedented rise in working age population, that's immigration. But there's only one housing unit that has been started for every 5.2 newcomers to Canada. Now, this is 5 standard deviations from the historical ratio of one housing unit started for every 1.8 people. So the current divergence between rental inflation and CPI inflation is at its highest level in over 60 years. Another factor that will feed into the slowdown in consumer spending. So rents are rising very rapidly. And we know that the Bank of Canada has to be concerned about this because the rent component of inflation is quite important. So though they are concerned that cutting interest rate is going to lead to a burst of housing activity and even less affordable housing, they also know that this is going to be a huge drag on the economy and that people can't afford to renew mortgages at today's interest rates. So this shows you that there is a record deficit in terms of housing supply. This is the ratio of the growth in working age population to housing starts, never been lower. And then to see this in historical perspective another way, this is the level of housing starts monthly over the last year. You see, it's no higher than what it was in the 1970s, with nearly double the population now. So inadequate, to say the least. And there is no way we're going to be able to meet housing demand anytime soon, because it would take 500,000 housing completions per year to meet the surge in housing demand. And we've never seen even half that amount in a single year. Now, it's a very tall order. Canada will need to grow its housing stock by an average of 315,000 units annually between now and 2030. And that's more than a third above the pace of housing completions in the past few years. Now, the government is doing what it can, it says. The federal government, other than CMHC housing, affordable housing programs, which are totally inadequate, the federal government has very little control over this. So there is no question that we need to see more action at the municipal level and provincial levels. We also have a shortage of construction workers, and most of the new construction workers will be the temporary foreign workers hoping to become citizens. Another huge problem is surging construction costs, which has impeded new home supply. So you see here that the growth of residential construction prices has surged, but by multiples of the overall level of the CPI inflation. So construction costs are rising too rapidly. Municipal development fees have also increased. We've got labor shortages. Construction wages have gone up 9.4% year over year. And because of environmental concerns, it's more expensive to build. Now, the HST tax was eliminated on new residential rental construction, including for students and seniors. So that's helpful, but still it's like a drop in the bucket. We are running up against enormous capacity constraints. Now, this shows you Canada's residential building construction investment. It has fallen sharply. And in fact, just today, the head of one of the trade groups for the Builders Association has said that builder sentiment is down at record low levels, and that not only is residential construction in a post-pandemic low, that he believes over the next year, residential construction activity will continue to be very modest as a direct result of all of these cost concerns. So, Eddie, that's it for my formal presentation. I hope I can hear you so I can answer some questions.
Can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to call you.
Okay, we'll do this on the phone. You know, Eddie, anything that can go wrong technically does. Gotcha.
Okay, so let me turn down my volume because I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. So we're right where we want to be, I think. You can put yours on speaker if you like, Sherry.
Okay, I will do that.
Perfect. Oh, maybe not. Actually, no, it's not going to work if it's on speaker. It's going to be a reverb. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, actually, yeah, there you go. Okay, so take it off speaker, put it on your ear. I'm sorry, that didn't work. Put it on your ear. Yeah. Take it off speaker.
Okay.
Yeah, that's better. That was my mistake. I thought we could do speaker, but we can't.
Okay.
So before we get into questions, we do have questions. I want to thank our sponsor, FCT, for today's ICW. Thank you, FCT. We love you. We do have some questions, but I want to talk about productivity because that has been coming up more and more. And I want to understand it a little bit better. So my understanding is that GDP per hour worked is productivity. It's the efficiency of the economy that makes up productivity. Am I right?
Right. It's the output per unit of labor.
So it makes sense that if productivity is going lower, then unemployment could rise because as a business, manufacturer, et cetera, you're sitting there going, okay, well, I don't need that many workers. I need more productivity, so I will lay off or.
Well, it impinges on corporate profits.
Okay.
So they're getting less for the same amount of wages.
Yeah, so 6 quarters straight of lower productivity is just not good for our country.
No.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Let's go to our first question. It says thoughts on carbon tax and its impact for June.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's no question the carbon tax is just another factor adding to inflation. So, but I mean, it's relatively small in the scheme of things, and we have seen gasoline prices, energy prices falling.
Okay, so we'll go to Jason Nugent. He asked, do we know how many single person households there are? I think he means single households, not persons. Might need some tax incentives to start renting out rooms in your home.
Yeah, no, he means like one person in a house or in a condo. They do once a year especially after a census, they publish that data. And there are a lot of single heads of households now, and with or without children. So yes, I suppose there is the opportunity to rent out rooms, but remember, I mean, there's a privacy issue as well. I don't think that's the answer to our housing shortage.
Yeah, that housing shortage, scary number, right? 500,000 per year is just not going to happen. And that's just going to continue and put a lot of pressure on prices, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so our next question is Bank of Canada will bring the rates down to 2.5% by next year. That's the prediction. You're saying 1.25% this year, continue on to next year, and then it'll be about halved by sometime next year.
Right. And the reason I'm saying only 2.5%, before the pandemic, rates were at 1.75% for the policy rate. But that followed a 10-year period when inflation averaged less than 2%. We're not going back to that world.
And do you think so we know that rates are going to be coming down. We know that house shortage is existing. We know that the pressure on house prices is going to be there as rates come down. You know, inventories are rising, like you said, but probably not to where we need it to be. Are we worried about where house prices could end up, especially in, you know, the bigger markets? Or do you think there's enough to absorb that we're going to be okay?
Well, there's no question that the bigger markets are going to see prices rising, and they're already very high. So affordability is a huge problem.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out throughout the spring market and so on. It's going to be definitely a busy time. For those of you, we talked about renewals. You said 60% coming up. I think that's more about the banks, but there's also the subprime, the private, et cetera. It could be up to over 80% of all these mortgages coming up for renewal in the next 3 years. What is the advice that you would give to someone that has or staring at, this really beautiful low rate that they got maybe a few years ago, and then coming up with this, daunting rate that, is going to definitely put a dent in their extra spending? What advice would you give them, Sherry?
Well, assuming that they aren't planning on moving anytime soon, I think they should consider a fixed rate mortgage for a short period of time, call it a year, and then see what rates look like a year from now, and then probably then lock in a variable rate.
Yeah, good advice. And by the way, if you are renewing or you're looking at that daunting future of future rates, give us a call. You can visit dominionlending.ca, and one of our brokers would be happy to go over your situation. There's our website there, and give you some really sound advice. A couple other questions here for you, Sherry. Do you expect inflation to go up or down with the next CPI report?
I think it'll go down.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if rates are coming down, should we get ready for another price boom? We just talked about that.
Yeah.
So price boom is a big word, right? So there's definitely going to see steady rises in price in the price of homes, and it's going to depend on where you live in the country. But if you are looking for a budget, contact one of our mortgage brokers. They can help you budget, make sure that you're ready for whatever it is that's coming at us. Because I know that multiple bids will be something to contend with. That's sometimes a very scary process when you're going in, but having a budget, having a pre-approval would be the best way to approach anything that's coming at us when it comes to price increases. Okay, this is one long one from Carlos. Hey, Carlos, hope you're doing well. Dr. Sherry Cooper, regarding the super core inflation X shelter, so minus shelter, in your opinion, does shelter inflation have influence on the super core, creating a negative loop, not allowing the inflation to ease, therefore preventing Bank of Canada to reduce rates?
Well, they're excluding shelter in super core. So, the super core numbers are still pretty high. But excluding the shelter part of it is useful because so much of it is mortgage interest, which is under the control of Bank of Canada.
Okay. One more question here. Sherry, do you foresee a larger uptake in variable rate mortgages over variable with a good discount?
Once all that starts happening, no question, it will be attractive again. But I mean, we've got to get more than a 25 or 50 basis point cut in overnight rates before they do become competitive. And then we'll see how anxious the banks are to fight for the business.
Right. So variable rate on a mortgage usually has a discount to that variable rate. It can be anywhere from prime to prime minus 80 or 90. So there's all of those to contend with. Put that into the formulas and make sure that you're comfortable with that rate going forward. Even though it's coming down, there's still got to be a comfort level with the payment, etc. Okay, is there a reason you would suggest a fixed shorter term over a variable?
Only because of the bank hasn't cut rates yet. That's for people that are renewing in the next month or 2 or 3.
Yeah, so basically you're just saying that, just hedge your sort of bet, go short term, wait for those rate cuts to come in, and then flip over to variable rate. The other way of doing it is going to a variable rate, knowing that they're coming down and being comfortable with that higher payment, but you have to weigh both options in order to get what works for you. Okay, is there a reason you should suggest that's the one we just read. Forget that one. Hello, Sherry. I was wondering, do you think mortgage qualifications will get easier?
But no way.
No. I mean, with the rising rate environment, it's hard enough. But when the rates go down, all it does is just give you more comfort level in the GDS and TDS. But overall, qualifying for a mortgage is not going to get easier. And those rules, I don't think there's anything that's going to change on the horizon. All right, so we got a few more minutes. Any more questions? I'm just going to fire some questions at you, Sherry, if that's okay. I know it's a little bit annoying with you holding the
No problem.
phone there. Where would you invest your money today, knowing that rates may be coming down? Obviously, GICs and fixed incomes were really, really attractive. Is there a sector or somewhere that you would put your money in today's world?
Well, Eddie, firstly, when interest rates come down, bond prices move up.
Okay.
Yes, the interest return is lower, but if you're a longer term investor, you might be happy to see bond prices rising sharply. So there's no reason to dump your bonds, quite the opposite. Now, when interest rates come down, the interest sensitive sectors of the stock market generally do very well. So those sectors, I believe, would be good investments. And who benefits more than the Canadian banks, which, that's talking my book, but they pay a dividend as well. So,
and they had
obviously there's all sorts of other sectors that Canada just has very little representation for. So that's where you look into the US market for opportunity.
Yeah, we saw some nice quarterly profits from those big banks, billions of dollars. They continue doing well. There's definitely no shortage of profits for those institutions. Okay, Simon Bilodeau asks, how is the U.S. election cycle will play on their interest rate moves, and how can that impact the Bank of Canada decisions? So is there influence from our friends from the South?
For sure. And yes, anything that happens in the U.S., we feel at least some reverberation. The Fed is not going to cut interest rates before the Bank of Canada. So whenever the Bank of Canada goes, I would expect the Fed to still be on hold. Their economy is very strong. And we're going to see employment data for both countries this Friday, and I would expect the U.S. to continue strong. The U.S. unemployment rate is at a rock bottom low. So the Fed isn't that anxious to cut rates. Now, in terms of the bigger issue, I think there's going to continue to be volatility based on everything from government shutdown risk in the U.S. to who actually wins the election. But, Canada will seem like a safe haven in comparison.
So as an American, Sherry, what are your thoughts on now it's going to be Biden versus Trump once again, the oldest candidate in history and the one with the most indictments in history? So I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Eddie, it makes me sick, to be honest.
It sure does, right?
There's no good choices. It's really horrible. I have a fantasy that Biden's going to back away and let the convention pick somebody that they think can beat Trump. It's not impossible, but believe me, I have no inside information. It's just wishful thinking.
And if Trump does win, how's that going to affect the Canadian economy? Positively, negatively, or the same?
Well, he loves oil. He's not concerned about global warming. We benefit from that economically. Forget what happens with the actual environment.
Right.
I don't think that Trump winning is good for anybody anywhere in the world, frankly, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Got a couple more questions, Sherry, and then we'll let you go. Please give some insights on outlook for influence of private lenders in the foreseeable future. Obviously, private lenders have played an inaugural part of lending, especially with clients that are looking to put some ends together. Will that continue being strong in the future, you think?
I think so. I do, especially given all the immigrants that once they've been here a few years, they're typically very anxious to buy, but they don't have a long credit record. So there'll always be a place for private lenders.
Yeah, I agree. Dr. Sherry Cooper, is it possible that Bank of Canada rate is preventing the inflation to ease further? So knowing that the biggest basket or pool of influence is shelter, is it like once they start lowering rates, isn't it going to even come back down even faster, or is that not?
I think it'll help initially.
Yeah.
But the slowdown in the economy is going to help even more.
Yeah, fair. Last question, and then we'll let you go. If Canada lowers rates before the USA, what impact will that have on our dollar? And
it'll weaken our dollar for sure. And in fact, every time a number comes out weaker than expected, we see the Canadian dollar take a bit of a hit.
Yeah. Well, listen, always full of great information. Lots to unpack there, Sherry. Thanks so much. Appreciate you, doing the phone thing. And, a couple of times a year we have some challenges.
I know.
You're always up for the challenge, and we somehow make it happen. So that's awesome. For everyone watching, thanks so much for tuning in. Our next one is April 10th. And I am going to go out of the way and say there is going to be a decrease
on April 10th.
I think April is the month where we start seeing rates come down. I could be wrong, but Sherry does say maybe June, definitely July, right? Maybe June, definitely.
Yeah.
Maybe June, definitely.
I think June, but Eddie, I hope you're right. I really do.
I hope so too. I'm going to go out of the way, and I talked to a few economists yesterday at the Toronto Symposium, and one of them did agree with me. He thinks that it might happen, so we'll see what happens. Thanks so much again for tuning in. Thanks so much for FCT for sponsoring. Until next time, have a great day.